Now, once he got on, did he ever reach back to you?
Yeah, Jay had me come and do Summer Jam with him one year. I think that was the time
Tupac went in the studio and did a song together. And then them little dudes.
Outlaws.
Yeah.
Outlaws.
They came, like, as soon as we got there, they came up to Pac talking about, yo, Lauryn Hill dissed you.
He really had an issue with Jay-Z. He really didn't like him then.
Not at all. And if Pac was alive, then it would have been a whole different story. And as much money as Jay-Z has, he still hasn't accomplished what Tupac accomplished before he was at 25 years.
It started with a pause. Big Daddy Kane leaned back in his chair, took a deep breath, and dropped a line that made the room go still. If Pac was alive, it would have been a whole different story. His voice didn't crack, but the weight behind the words said enough. That moment felt less like an interview and more like a confession, a truth he'd held in for years suddenly breaking free. And the silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was history knocking at the door. Because if what Kane said was true, then everything we thought we knew about Jay-Z's rise to power might not be the full story. Did Jay really climb his way to the throne on his own brilliance? Or was his empire built on borrowed light, faded loyalty, and quiet betrayals that the world was never supposed to see? Kane had always been the mentor figure, the man who gave Jay his very first shot on stage when no one else was paying attention. Back in the early 90s, Kane was already a king, running packed shows, living larger than life. Jay, he was just another hungry kid from Brooklyn, trying to make his voice heard in a city already drowning in talent. But Kane saw something. He brought Jay on tour, let him freestyle during set changes, even pushed his demos into the hands of label execs who barely looked up. For Kane, it wasn't charity, it was belief. For Jay, it was survival. But the higher Jay rose, the quicker Kane's name seemed to disappear from the story. Sure, in Jay's book Decoded, he gave a nod, saying Kane taught him pacing and stage presence. But that was it. No heartfelt gratitude, no repeated acknowledgement, just a line in a book, almost like checking a box. Meanwhile, Kane was watching his own spotlight dim while Jay's grew brighter by the year. And when whispers began that Jay had slid in a slick jab at Kane on the track Do It Again, referencing his signature eyebrow slits, the tension that had quietly been brewing suddenly had teeth. Kane played it cool, brushing it off. But if you look closely, the sting was there. And then came Tupac. Pac wasn't just another rapper on the rise. He was a storm, a force of nature who could make entire crowds tremble with just one verse. Where Jay was smooth, calculated, and polished, Pac was raw, reckless, and real. He spoke like a man who knew time was short, and maybe he did. By the mid-90s, Pac had already started throwing shade in Jay's direction, questioning his authenticity, and even flat-out dismissing him as a threat. To Pac, Jay wasn't competition. He was an afterthought. But here's where it gets chilling. Behind the scenes, the tension wasn't just about music, it was about survival. Kane had been there at the beginning, trying to build Jay up. Pac, on the other hand, saw the cracks before anyone else. He called out the fake smiles, the hidden power plays, the industry moves made behind closed doors. And when Jay dropped Brooklyn's finest with Biggie at the height of the East Coast versus West Coast war, it wasn't just a bad look, it was gasoline on an open flame. Irv Gotti even begged him not to do it, warning it could spark something dangerous. Jay did it anyway. The result? Pac's fury was now aimed directly at him. Tracks like Bomb First and Friends carried bars that cut straight to Jay, making it clear he wasn't safe when the storm Pac had unleashed on the East. Fans waited for Jay to respond, to fire back. But he didn't. Not publicly. Instead, he stayed quiet, careful, calculated, exactly the opposite of Pac's reckless energy. But what nobody knew at the time was that Jay had written a diss track. It was brutal. It was direct. And he held it back, like a loaded weapon he was too scared to fight. Until after Pac was gone. And that's when things got dark. Because instead of burying that track, Jay performed it live at the Apollo after Pac's death. According to DJ Clark Kent, it was vicious, the kind of diss that would have started a war if Pac had still been alive. And that raised one haunting question. Was Jay holding back out of respect or out of fear? But the revelations didn't stop there. Years later, Pac's former associates claimed Jay was so shaken by Pac's presence that he refused to leave his hotel room in Vegas if Pac was in town. The idea of crossing paths wasn't competition, it was danger. And if that story is true, then Jay's rise wasn't built on fearless ambition. It was built on avoidance, on waiting out the storm until it passed. But storms don't just pass. They leave wreckage. And for Jay, the wreckage wasn't just Tupac. It was the people he left behind on his own side. Kane, Dumb, Biggs. Friends, mentors, brothers who started noticing that the closer Jay got to power, the further he drifted from loyalty. And what came next? It would shake the foundation of Roc-A-Fella itself. The cracks in Jay-Z's empire didn't show up overnight. They started quietly behind closed doors in whispers that never made the headlines. Roc-A-Fella wasn't just a label, it was a revolution. Jay-Z, Dame Dash, and Kareem Biggs Burke had built something that felt untouchable, a dynasty born out of street hustle and ambition. Together, they made Roc-A-Fella a household name, with Jay as the voice, Dame as the fire, and Biggs as the silent architect. But even in the glow of their success, something darker was moving underneath. Industry insiders say Jay was already making quiet moves long before anyone saw them coming. While Dame was out front, loud, brash, and unapologetically shaking the industry, Jay was behind the scenes in hushed meetings with Def Jam executives, negotiating power that didn't include his so-called brothers. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't loyalty either. It was calculation. When the fallout finally hit, it was cold. Dame Dash, one of the loudest champions of Jay's career, was blindsided. He later admitted he didn't even get a warning. One day, the rock was theirs. The next, Jay had maneuvered himself into becoming president of Def Jam, while Roc-A-Fella was split in two. And the name? The artists? The resources? Jay walked away with all of it. Dame was left holding memories of an empire he thought they built together. Biggs was pushed into the shadows. The dynasty was fractured in a single move. For some, it was business. For others, it was betrayal. Because Jay didn't just win, he won alone. The very people who poured blood and sweat into his rise were left standing outside the empire they helped create. And as the years went by, their names started disappearing from the story too. No Roc-A-Fella without Jay. No acknowledgement of the sacrifices made in those early years. Just silence. And that silence is what industry veterans started noticing most. When people spoke out about Jay's moves, the voices didn't last long. Stories went quiet, interviews clipped, entire narratives rewritten until Jay stood alone in the frame. And the question became, was this survival or was this erasure? Even Dame, years later, admitted Jay changed the moment power became real. He stopped being a brother, stopped being a partner, and started moving like a boss who didn't want old ties holding him back. It wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about image, about controlling the story, about removing anyone who could remind the world he didn't get here alone. But if Roc-A-Fella's collapse painted Jay as ruthless, what came next only deepened the mystery. Because while Jay was distancing himself from Kane, dodging Tupac's storm, and cutting ties with Dame, he was also building tighter connections with people Pac had openly distrusted. The same names tied to the darkest moments in hip-hop's history. And that's where things get even harder to explain. Because after Biggie's death, Jay didn't just mourn, he moved. He stepped into roles that hadn't even been filled yet. Aligned himself with executives who controlled the industry's power. Slid into spaces Pac had warned the world about. And suddenly, the same man who once freestyled on Kane's tour and dodged Pac's fury was being hailed as the heir to the very throne Pac and Big left behind. But not everyone bought it. Whispers started to spread that Jay's rise wasn't natural, it was orchestrated. Calculated moves, timed releases, strategic alliances. The word that kept coming up wasn't genius. It was cold, and then came the quietest but most telling detail of all. The people who were there at the beginning, the ones who shared studios, stages, and late-night hustles with him, were gone. No Kane, no Dame, no real circle from the old days. Just ghosts. But why? Why would someone who claimed to value loyalty above all else move through the industry, leaving so many behind? Was it protection? Or is it something deeper? Because the deeper you look, the more you realize Jay didn't just outwork his competition. He outlasted them. And in doing so, he may have outgrown loyalty altogether. But what came next would expose a side of Jay that fans still argue about today. A moment where ambition and betrayal collided in public view, leaving scars that never really healed. What unsettled people the most wasn't Jay-Z's success. It was the silence around it. The kind of silence that doesn't happen naturally. It happens when voices are cut off, when people are either scared to speak or pay to keep their stories buried. And the closer you look, the more you realize that silence wasn't empty. It was strategic. Because while Kane's name faded and Dame was pushed aside, Jay was building alliances that Tupac had already warned the world about. Pac had seen the shift coming, the rap game moving away from messages and substance toward power plays and corporate ambition. He didn't just rap about it. He said it plainly. There were snakes in the industry, men who would trade loyalty for leverage, brothers for business. And one of the names he never trusted was Sean Diddy Combs. Because for every fan who calls him the greatest of all time, there are just as many who describe him with one word: calculated. Jay didn't just move like an artist. He moved like a strategist. Every album, every partnership, every feud was treated like a chess match. Even his infamous beef with Nas, one of the most raw and personal battles in rap history, ended not in endless war, but in business. Jay signed Nas to Def Jam when he became president of the label. To fans, it felt like dominance. To others, it felt like control. Another rival folded into his empire, another voice silenced beneath his narrative. And this wasn't new. Look back, and you see the same playbook. Build with Kane, then step out on his own. Build with Dame and Biggs, then take the empire without them. Stand next to Diddy when it benefited him, then quietly step away when the scandals came. Each move calculated, each alliance temporary, each ending leaving someone behind. That's why the word cold never left him. For years, artists who once stood beside him, Beanie Siegel, Cameron, Jay-Z, would hint at the same truth. Jay was brilliant, but he wasn't built on loyalty. He was built on survival. And yet, for all the criticism, the other side of the debate is just as loud. Because in the harsh reality of the music industry, maybe survival is the ultimate skill. Maybe what people call cold, others call discipline. Maybe the same moves that left friends bitter also made Jay the only rapper from his era to transcend hip-hop and build generational wealth. That's the contradiction at the center of his legacy. He's the man who studied Kane, rivaled Pac, battled Nas, and still outlasted them all. The man who turned Marcy Projects into Madison Square Garden, who went from hustling on street corners to shaking hands with presidents. The dream every rapper once had, Jay made real. But the cost of that dream was heavy, and the ghosts of that cost never left. Because no matter how high Jay climbed, the whispers never stopped. Whispers about Kane, about Dame, about loyalty, about silence. Whispers that maybe Tupac was right about the snakes in the industry, and Jay wasn't just navigating them, he had become one. And that's the debate that will follow Jay-Z forever. Was he the greatest of all time? Or was he simply the greatest at playing the game? In the end, Jay-Z's story is as much about erasure as it is about success. He is the product of Big Daddy Kane's early spotlight, the rival Pac once warned the world about, the partner Dame Dash built an empire with, and the competitor Nas once clashed with on wax. But if you ask Jay today, you might never hear those names in the same breath. Because the empire he built wasn't designed to share the spotlight. It was designed for one man, one name, one legacy, Jay-Z. And maybe that's why his journey remains so polarizing. To some, he's the blueprint. The hustler who turned rap into a global business, who rose higher than anyone imagined hip-hop could go. To others, he's the cold operator, the man who cut ties, erased names, and rewrote history until he stood alone at the top. So the question remains, what will history remember? The brilliance or the betrayal? One thing's for sure, in hip-hop, every story has two sides. And sometimes, the truth is hidden between the lines no one speaks. If you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because we've got more stories just like this, diving deep into the untold rivalries, the behind-the-scenes betrayals, and the legends who shaped the game. And if you want to keep the energy going, don't stop here. Check out our other videos where we break down the stories behind hip-hop's biggest icons, feuds, and secrets. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. This is Star Watch 247, and this was the story of Jay-Z, Kane, Tupac, and the legacy of ambition. Stay tuned.